Welcome to Astronomy Toronto. My name is Randy Attwood. Well, it's been 15 years since the last men walked on the surface of the moon. Today we'll find out what a trip to the moon was really like, as told by someone who took one of those trips. We'll be talking to Charles Duke Jr., who traveled to the moon on Apollo 16 in April 1972. Mr. Duke talks to us from his home in New Braunfels, Texas. Well, hello, Mr. Duke. How are things down in Texas?
Well, it's a beautiful day, Randy. We almost 70 degrees.
Can you believe that it's been 15 years since Apollo 16?
It's hard to believe at times, and other times I think it's been an eternity. But generally, my feelings are that, golly, where did all the time go? It's been 15 years.
Take us back, if you would, getting ready for your flight. What did an astronaut have to do to get ready to fly to the moon?
Well, in the Apollo, depending on your job, if you were a command module pilot, which meant you stayed in orbit around the moon while the other two crewmen landed, your training was slightly different. You didn't have to worry about the lunar surface activity of the rover or the spacesuit work and things like that. That's what we did. We had to learn geology. We had to learn about the science of the moon, the geology of our landing site as best we could determine from photogeology, and we had to learn all about the experiments that we were to do on the moon. And then we had to learn to fly the spacecraft, which was our primary emphasis in training. The command module pilot did similar things during his training sequence. He learned how to fly the spacecraft and learned how to conduct the experiments that he was going to do from orbit. And then he did a lot of work on the extravehicular activity that we had on our way home.
The geology fascinates me. You and your co-lunar walker, John Young, you came up to Sudbury for some of your training, didn't you?
That's correct. One of our trips was at Sudbury. It was the major impact crater, and most of the craters on the moon are made by meteorite impact, and so the geology, it was assumed, of the lunar craters would be very similar to the geology of the Earth craters, which it was. Much of it was similar.
Well, let's go back to the day you took off, left the Earth on April 16th, 1972. Boy, I can't imagine sleeping the night before traveling to the moon. That must have been rough.
Well, it was a busy time during our training, the final frenzied preparations, and we got to bed fairly late, if I remember, and I don't recall any real problem then. First night in space, I had a very difficult time getting to sleep, but the night before, we just sort of, or at least I did, had no trouble at all sleeping, and I bounced out of bed the next morning ready to go.
Well, tell me about preparations. I guess in the morning you had breakfast and then put on your spacesuit. And
first thing in the morning of launch, we had a physical. After we woke up and sort of cleaned, you know, how you get up and wash your face and take care of those kind of things. We then had a physical, which was very brief, just make sure we could walk and talk primarily, didn't have any temperature or thing like that, any fever. And then we went to breakfast, and there was a whole pack of people there at breakfast that was to sort of help us get off and to help us encourage us on our way. And then we went to the suit room and we got suited up in our spacesuits, and we stayed there for about an hour or so and before we went out to the launch pad. And we finally hit the pad about 2 hours before liftoff, if I recall.
So tell me about what it's like to be launched off in one of those incredible Saturn V rockets.
Saturn was an immense machine, as you recall. It was 360 feet tall and about 33 feet in diameter and weighed around 6.5 million pounds as it was full of fuel. And so we took the elevator up the side of the rocket in the launch tower and climbed in and was strapped in, and about an hour and a half before liftoff we were secure inside, and they closed the hatch and gave us a pressure check. And so we just lay there and waited for liftoff and hoping that the countdown would continue and go on schedule. It's really not too comfortable in the spacesuit on your back in 1G, and so you were eager to get it off on schedule. And we did launch right on schedule, and you're really tense as the seconds tick off towards liftoff and ignition. Actually, things get very, very tense and very, very quiet inside. And then at ignition, which was 8 seconds before liftoff, they lit the 5 engines in the Saturn, and it was a muffled roar you began to hear, and the vehicle started to vibrate. And as the thing vibrated, the countdown continued, and the engines came up to full power. And then at T0, if all was going well, they gave a launch commit, and they released you, and then you slowly started to move upward like an elevator going up in a large building. But it was vibrating very, very hard from side to side. And so that was the attention getter for me, was the vibration in the vehicle.
You mentioned that being on the spacesuit on your back in 1G was uncomfortable. As you increased in acceleration, the G's increased. That must have been quite uncomfortable.
Well, it was, you really didn't notice it. Your attention was on the instruments, the dynamics of flight, and you know, 4.5 G's didn't seem much different than 1G for me at that point. And so I really didn't notice it. The G level was a slow build-up, and it was only above 4 G's for just a few seconds, and then the engine shut down, and then after that, you felt like you were in a train wreck, if you will, as you went from 4.5 G's to 0 in just a few microseconds.
So you're really thrown forward.
Well, you would have been had you not been strapped in very, very securely into your couch.
Well, once in orbit, was it essentially, you were in orbit for a period of time, were you not?
About 1.5 revolutions around the Earth. We left Kennedy, we went over Kennedy again on our first rev, and then halfway around over Australia, the second time over Australia, we ignited our third stage S4B engine to accelerate us out of Earth orbit on the way to the moon.
Well, really, once in Earth orbit, that was your first real chance to look down at the Earth. Was it a busy time? Could you take a few glances out the window?
Well, I was too busy to take but more than one glance. In fact, I don't remember looking out except, maybe twice. Once right after we got into orbit, and you could see the Atlantic Ocean. We were over the middle of the Atlantic, and it was just beautiful with the deep blue of the water and the blackness of space all framed in one window of the spacecraft. And then the next time I was able to look out, we were over Houston. It was about an hour later, and we had almost been around the Earth. And over Houston, I could roll around in zero gravity and look out the hatch window, and it was there was Houston, the whole city, and Galveston Bay, and all of the Gulf Coast of Texas just framed in that one window, and it was spectacular.
All right, well, tell me, you had one major job after you headed out towards the moon, and that had to deal with your lunar module.
That's true. Right after we started out, we had to retrieve the lunar module from its launch position, which was beneath the command module. And as we turned the spacecraft around to get in position for this first docking maneuver, we noticed some particles floating away from the lunar module, and it looked like a spray of crystallized fluid to us. And we were very concerned. It was coming from an area of the acid engine tank. And our first impression was, oh, there goes the mission. It's leaking gas. So we reported this to Houston, and they said, well, just continue your docking. And as we did so, then they changed the flight plan, and we had to then go into the lunar module and power up for a short time to check and see if this, in fact, was fuel leaking out. Turned out it was not. What it actually was a thermal paint covering had been applied incorrectly, and it was peeling off as the deep space, the vacuum and the sun hit it. And so we really didn't have a problem as we thought.
Like paint in your shower stalls.
That's exactly right. Or on the outside of a house that's weathered, you know. It peels off.
Well, Charlie, a lot of people probably have wondered why astronauts call their lunar module strange names and their command module strange names. You named yours Orion and Casper. Tell me about that.
Well, Ken Mattingly, the command module pilot, picked Casper. Why, I don't know. We selected Orion, which is a bright wintertime star constellation in the northern hemisphere. The reason we had to select names was that during the rendezvous phases of the mission, or when we were separated into two spacecraft, Houston had to call us something. It couldn't have been, they could have said Apollo A and Apollo B, but that wasn't very dramatic or romantic. And so we collected, or selected, I should say, names that would have the, to us anyway, the connotation of space. And so we picked Orion for ours. That was the motivation behind us. I can't tell you why Ken selected Casper. So during the rendezvous, we'd say, Casper, this is Orion, you know, typical radio communication between two aircraft.
Right. Tell me about the 3-day trip to the moon. What did you do?
Well, there was a lot of activity that we had to devote ourselves to. Housekeeping chores took up a major part of the time. As you had to learn to live together and unstow your food and unstow your clothing and unstow your waste management system, and then put everything back in the proper place. And we had these little hammocks that we had, or sleeping bags, I should say, in the evenings. And so it was, first day or so was just getting adjusted to one another and the environment of the command module. And we had a few experiments that first day, and we had a couple of mid-course corrections to make sure we were right on track. Then we started into some experiments. We had an electrophoresis experiment. We had some, I forgot what they call these cosmic particles that were bombarding us. We had an experiment to try to identify what those were. The light flash experiment, that's what it was. And then we had some photographic work that we had to do of deep space. And other than that, it was just, you know, maintaining your timeline and waiting with great expectation the day you hit lunar orbit.
Well, Charlie, you said that you had trouble sleeping the first night. Overall, how did you adapt to zero gravity?
Well, first couple of hours, I thought this was going to be a disaster for me. Zero gravity had the distinct impression that, to me, that I was going to be seasick. And I had gotten seasick while I was at the Naval Academy every time I went out on a ship. And so I said, well, 11 days of being seasick is going to be terrible. But fortunately, a couple hours later, I noticed that that nauseous feeling had gone away, and I was in great shape. I was bouncing off the walls with John and Ken. They didn't have any trouble at all. Sleeping, first night, well, I should say just about every night, except on the way home, I had to take a little light sleeping pill to sort of put your mind in idle, you know, so that you could calm down and go to sleep. Your mind was racing 90 miles a minute, it seemed like, the whole time we were airborne, thinking about the next day's activities, thinking about the beauty of space, looking at the sights, worried about the spacecraft, etc. So to calm down at night, I took a sleeping pill. John had no problem at all. He just closed his eyes and went to sleep. It's amazing ability he had. But the sleeping pill was enough for me, and so sleep was pretty good.
Well, being in an astronomical show, we're all curious, what could you see out the window on the way to the moon, apart from, say, the sun, earth, and moon?
That's about it, Randy. You couldn't, the sun was shining so brightly on the spacecraft that you could not see any of the stars as you just looked out of the window. Now with the telescope that we had, you could identify some of the major stars as you gathered the light in a 28-power telescope. But just looking out the window with the brightness of the sunshine, you couldn't see anything but Earth, Moon, and Sun. And the sun is so bright that you dare not look at it, even with special lenses. So we really never looked at the sun.
All right. So once we get out to the moon, how do you get into lunar orbit? What do you have to do with the spacecraft?
Well, of course, the tracking is all done from the Earth through the manned spacecraft tracking network, and they give you information that you feed into your computer that when you cycle through the computer programs, it will orient the spacecraft in the correct position, so that when you ignite the engine, you're decreasing your velocity vector. The reason for that, when you get to the moon, the lunar gravity is accelerating the spacecraft as you enter the sphere of the moon's influence. And so when you get to the moon, you're going too fast to stay in orbit, so you have to slow down to get into orbit. And so we had to position our spacecraft in such a manner that when we ignited the engine, the velocity vector would be decreased in the right direction to put us in the appropriate orbit, which was 60 miles by 160 miles above the above the moon. And that burn, if I remember, took about 6 minutes, and it's a long time. You're doing it in darkness. By this time, you're behind the moon, or not behind the moon, but on the dark side of the moon, and you look out the window, take a peek out the window, and you don't see anything, and you're just hoping that you're in the right position, and Earth hasn't fouled up, and you're about to crash into the moon. And sure enough, right after our burn was complete, the computer said we were in orbit, and almost immediately we came into sunlight on the backside of the moon, and it was spectacular. It was a typical 2001 impression as you entered orbit for the first time at the moon. It was very, very stark, but very, very spectacular.
Sort of like the photographs that you've seen of the moon from previous flights, but not like them.
That's correct. The photograph, it picks up the barrenness and picks up the craters and the hills, but it just doesn't have the emotion to it that you have as you watch it in real life. You're actually there looking at it with your own eyes, and it's a very emotional time, really, as you glide across this lifeless, barren landscape that has just no sound to it. And in the spacecraft, you just hear the hums of the inverters and the electrical system, and so it was almost an eerie feeling.
Well, when it came time for you and John Young to go down to the moon, Talk us through the separation and then the problem that Casper had.
Well, that problem with Casper was the major problem we had. Prior to that, we'd had a number of smaller problems that were impacting the timeline in our lunar module checkout. One was an antenna, a communications antenna didn't work correctly, and another was the not the environmental, but the reaction control system regulators failed on one system. And then we had some other little problems in the lunar module. But an hour before we were to land on the moon, on the back side of the moon, Ken Mattingly is preparing for a main engine burn to adjust his orbit from 60 miles by 8 miles up to 60 miles circular. And this was a major burn, and he was to do it by himself. And as he was checking this engine out, he noticed that the backup control system, when it was turned on, the engine just oscillated violently, and he thought that the whole thing was going to shake off the spacecraft. And of course, he notified us, and our first impressions were bitter disappointment, because with the problem that he reported, we knew we were in serious trouble and we weren't going to get to land on the moon.
You'd need to use the lunar module to get you home again?
We had to use, our initial thought was, well, we got to use this lunar module to get us out of orbit and get us home, and that, when you decide that, the landing's gone. So we got very, very upset. John was concerned, and we started a rendezvous again. We were about a mile apart at this point. And we came around the front side of the moon in contact with the Earth, and they began to look at the telemetry and all of the problem. And they just told us to stand by, but to prepare to get ready to come home. And as we came around, we orbited another time, and things weren't looking quite so bad. They said, we're working on it, stand by, there's still a chance. And then the next time around, they gave us permission to land. And so we were elated, and 6 hours behind schedule, we made our landing.
Wow, that must have been one of the most exciting parts. I can imagine a lunar landing as one of the greatest elevator rides that you can possibly have. Tell us about what you were doing during the landing.
Okay, the landing was, to me, the most exciting part of the whole mission. I think for two reasons. First, it's very dynamic. You can only plan up to a certain point what you're going to see and do. You have to adjust to depending on the terrain. And then again, we were 6 hours late landing, and so that great relief that at least we're going to get a chance at it was adding to the excitement. My job during the landing phase, which took about 12 minutes from the start of the engine to touchdown, was to monitor the systems, make sure the computer programs were cycling correctly, make any adjustments to trajectory as called for the landing radar. A number of systems work like that, and so in effect I was mostly inside and was not responsible for looking out the window and picking the landing site. That was John's job. And so in the last few thousand feet, of course, he had the moon in view and our the landing site in view. And I was calling out all this information to him, like our altitude, our rate of velocity, our horizontal, lateral motions, those kind of things, fuel states. So he wouldn't have to look at the gauges. He could keep concentrated directly on that landing site. And so the closer we got, the more he took over manual control of the spacecraft, and by the time we were about 500 feet above the moon, he was in full manual control of the lunar module, which meant throttle and attitude control. And so we selected a landing site, and about this time I began to look out more and more, because I wanted to make sure on our side that we weren't landing on a large rock or a big crater or something of that nature that he couldn't see from his side of the spacecraft. And so I divided my time between the inside and the outside, if you will, and kept calling out altitude, rate of descent, fuel states primarily, and right on schedule, we got a little blue light came on inside that said lunar contact, and when we got that light, we shut down the engine and dropped in the last 3 or 4 feet. And we were elated, of course.
I bet. I remember hearing you describe as you looked out the window. It sounded like 2 kids in a candy store.
Right. We were, that's the way we felt, like a little 5-year-old at Christmas morning, and candy store and everything else rolled into one.
I guess the next thing was getting ready to go outside. Did you go outside right away?
Well, that was the plan, but unfortunately, due to the long delay while they were figuring out what the problem was with the command module, that extended our day too long, and if we had stayed with the original flight plan, it meant we would have had a 35-hour day before we could have gotten to sleep. And so they canceled that first EVA, I should say delayed it. And we took our first rest period before we went outside instead of after. And when we did that, that meant we had to power down the lunar module, we had to take our suits off, we had to change a lot of the flight plan and the updates and everything that just required a lot of extra work. And so, but we did that, and then we put up our hammocks and went to sleep. I think it was about 6 hours after we landed on the moon. And then we slept 8 hours, then we got up and we got suited up again and got ready to go outside for the first time.
Join us on the next Astronomy Toronto when Charlie Duke will describe his 3-day adventure on the moon.
I was ready to go from the very beginning. Generally, they gave you a few minutes to adapt to 16G on the moon, but I just felt like I was ready to go, and I bounded off the ladder. The ride was very rough and very wild, I'd call it. You had to buckle your seatbelt because the thing was so springy, and the shock absorbers gave you so much rebound that without a seatbelt, it felt like it would throw you out. The Earth was a half Earth as we looked at it, and it was just a jewel of blue and white.